first of all, welcome everyone. My name is Danny McNamara, and I am one of the co-chairs of Green Left, along with Becky, whom you can see has joined us. Becky says that she needs to leave in 45 minutes. And thank you very much indeed for coming along to this Green Left meeting on the Green Socialist New Deal. We are scheduled to go through until 7:30 without any breaks, but as always, if anyone needs a break, then please feel absolutely free to take one whenever. The format for this evening will be that first of all we shall hear from our speakers, of whom there are three, and then we shall move on to a question and answer session towards the end. As always, I ask people, if you're not speaking, if you're not called to speak, then please remain on mute at all other times. If at the end, when we open it up for questions, if you wish to raise a question, then ideally raise your Zoom hand, using the Zoom feature to raise hand, because raising a physical hand will not always attract the chair's attention, especially if we get to the situation where the attendance spills over onto two screenfuls, and normally that happens if we get to 25 participants or more. Alternatively, if you wish to ask a question and you cannot or would prefer not to raise your Zoom hand, then I'm going to ask perhaps if you could send questions in the chat to Roy Sanderson. And Roy, I have not discussed this with you, but are you happy to be someone who receives written questions and then calls them out for us towards the end? A thumbs up will do.
I can't do it, Danny, unfortunately, because I'm going to a union meeting in about 50 minutes. Okay,
well, in that case, if people send written questions to me, that'll be fair enough. And if that doesn't work, then it's permissible to come off mute and simply use your voice to attract my attention, but please only use that as a last resort if for whatever reason those other methods will not work for you. Do have your camera on or off as you choose, but bear in mind that we're recording it, so if you wish not to be seen, then best to keep your camera off. Ideally, please don't use the chat to share your private opinions with everyone else. It's very tempting to do that, but it can often be a distraction, especially for different neurotypes who find having things going on in multiple threads makes it difficult to concentrate. So your cooperation is appreciated in all of these areas. So this meeting has been organised by Green Left, as you can see from the calling notice. Green Left, of course, is the eco-socialist tendency within the Green Party of England and Wales, and we exist to promote and to collaborate on eco-socialist perspectives, both within the Green Party of England and Wales and outside of the Green Party of England and Wales, with other organisations on the left, both in the UK and internationally. So, Green Socialist New Deal, it appears that more or less every organisation you can think of now is publishing a Green New Deal of some sort or other just now. Green Left published ours back in October, so this is now December, so very recently indeed. But we recognise that ours is a work in progress, and indeed, in all probability, pretty much every other Green New Deal is a work in progress also. So we are viewing this evening as part of a process of helping us all inside the Green Party and outside of the Green Party to pick our way through a complex forest of competing considerations which can help us identify what a Green Socialist New Deal needs to contain, excuse me one moment, and what kind of values it ought to encapsulate. And to give us an angle to come at this question from, we are considering, amongst other things, how we make a green socialist New Deal appealing to young people in particular, who are bearing much of the brunt of systemic inequality, intergenerational inequality at the moment, but by looking at how a green socialist New Deal offers promise for the future. And to help us with these questions, we're going to hear first of all from three speakers, two of whom are with us so far, excuse me. And it may be that the third joins us a little bit later. So the initial schedule that I had in mind was that we would hear first of all from Mark Douglas of Green Left. Now, as I said, we published the Green Socialist New Deal in October. It was a collaborative venture, but the principal author, if you like, the principal coordinator was Mark. So we're going to hear from Mark on the Green Left, Green Socialist New Deal. And then then we've got a speaker. Well, we had hoped to have a speaker from the Women's Budget Group. And the Women's Budget Group describes itself as an independent organisation that monitors the impact of government policies on men and women. They put forward policies for a more gender equal future, and they build the capacity of women and women's groups to participate in economic debates. Now, unfortunately, the guest speaker who was scheduled to represent the Women's Budget Group has had to stand down because of work commitments. But another member of Green Left, Jay Ginn, has offered to take us through some material that has been supplied by the Women's Budget Group under the title of A Feminist Green New Deal Towards a Green and Caring Economy. Again, just 1 second, please. Sorry, frog in the throat. And then finally, the Greener Jobs Alliance is a coalition of organisations which aim collectively to build support for the policies and the investments and the partnerships and the commitments that are needed to drive the transition to a low carbon economy. And this evening, to give us the Greener Jobs Alliance perspective on our topic, we'll be hearing from the Secretary of the Greener Jobs Alliance, Tahir Latif. And hello Tahir, and thank you very much for coming along. So as you can see, Jay is not with us currently. So my proposed order, if Jay arrives in time, will be Mark and then Jay and then Tahir. But Tahir, if Jay does not join us in time, then we may have to tweak that, in which case we'll have Mark and then Tahir and then Jay. So Tahir, if you can be on standby, I see the thumbs up, that's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. So before we start formally, is everyone clear on the procedure? Looks as if we are. Okay, thank you very much. So with that, I'm now going to hand over to Mark, and Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, friends. Nice to be here to discuss some proper politics. I'm Mark. I live in Hackney. I've been a member of Green Left since the mid-2000 or 2006 or so. And yeah, it's good to promote some proper politics, I believe, at this time. It was the 2019 election, which seems like a long time ago, but it was actually only 3 years, wasn't it? When the Labour Party and the Green Party produced manifestos which had some similarity, because each had a variety of a Green New Deal in them, in chapters. I think that struck us as being a new development, really, in British politics. And I mean, it each had their limitations, it has to be said. The Green Party did have a good go at it. I mean, it's quite a solid chapter. I mean, it's an 80-page document. I'm sure whether most of you actually looked at it, I don't know. But it had some radical Corbynite policies, which shocked the establishment, I'm sure, shocked the ruling class, and they shifted might and main to make sure that Labour didn't get elected in that election. Of course, the Tories were lucky; they had the populist Boris on their front side to make sure that maybe that didn't happen. Anyway, looking at the Labour and Green manifestos, we thought that really we need a combination of some of these policies. You know, we need to merge Green and socialist politics together. And I'm surprised that no one's actually done before. There's several people, several academic researchers have written kind of books. You know, we've got the Americans who produced one, don't we, and other academic kind of people rather than activists. You know, so we started work on our platform. It's a modest platform. In 2020, and it's taken us 2 years and 15 odd drafts to get to the final version this year, and we're pleased to present it for everyone in this autumn. It's still only 2 months old, isn't it? So I mean, the main points of our platform are that we've got to drive forward a decarbonisation of our economy, and we've got to create, as my friend Danny said, a habitable planet in the next 10 plus years, and that demands a lot of work on reducing carbon and methane and nitrous oxide and other pollutants from our economies. And it's a worldwide process, but we've got to start where we are locally, in my view, and that's the first main point about the platform: carbon accounting, carbon taxation, and carbon budgeting, and of course, eventually, some form of rationing system. Now, you know, other people don't like talking about rationing, but I think if we're going to move off from carbon seriously, we've got to move towards a taxation system. I don't believe any other parties proposing that currently, and we would well, Green Party mentioning it, obviously they're talking about it, and we need to push forward on that. So that's the main thing: we're investing in renewable energy and phasing out all carbon industries, and at the same time expanding electrification and the recycling and reuse of loads of materials. A major expansion. I envisage hundreds of thousands of new jobs in the recycling sector. So we move on from there to the second main point of our platform, which is the transition of workers affected by decarbonisation. And we're talking, I think we're talking over 1 million workers. I mean, we haven't done a proper count. Maybe we should do that. We need more research on that. But deploying workers from carbon-intensive industries to low and zero carbon energy, construction, and refitting. I mean, there's thousands of new jobs there. We reckon we need about 500,000 workers just to retrofit housing all over the country, and we've got a target there of retrofitting up to 1 million homes a year. Sounds like a lot, but if you think there's 400 districts in Britain, England and Wales, they've each got to employ hundreds of workers to work through the retrofit of all the old housing in Britain. It's the major economic sector that we're proposing, and it's the one way of dealing with energy reducing energy and creating warm homes and expanding useful employment in the country. So we can discuss how many that involves. My article I wrote for the Greener Jobs newsletter discussed all the different jobs that are involved, and it involves about 8 different jobs. You know, we're not just talking electricians, plumbers, fitters, labourers, joiners, even horticulturists. We need to green all our neighbourhoods that need it, especially in the north. And we need to start with the coldest, the poorest housing, which is north of England, South Wales, parts of the Midlands, parts of Scotland. And we've just got to get a move on this, and we've got to build up political pressure to get that going. And alongside that, we need trade unions and communities at the local level to devise plans for carrying out this decarbonisation of the economy. We've got to involve disabled people, carers, and that in developing new areas of expansion, like a climate plan for each district and for each sector of industry. You know, it's going to be changed, and we need to break down the division between urban and rural areas. We need growth in clean transport. That means completely electrifying railways, electric buses, yes, electric cars, shared cars. There's hundreds of new jobs involved there. And you know, there is no danger really of proper unemployment in all our schemes. In housing, we've got to not just retrofit housing, we've got to build new eco houses in every district. There's a debate going on about how much housing can be built. I think we could say that we need at least 100,000 new housing units a year, spread across England, Wales. We've got to agree on what land we've got to use up all the empty buildings that are around. We've got to decide how big these houses are. But I reckon we can build eco flats in many places that, you know, would be built to a human scale, not more than about 8 stories high. And then finally, there's the care sector. There's supposed to be 1 million workers in the care service industry, and they're all pretty lowly paid. We need a new care service industry which deals with the pent-up demand from disabled and elderly people that need care. And I reckon there's hundreds of thousands of new jobs there that have to be properly paid, proper trade unions, and a good service. But they're all kind of new jobs we need, I think. I'll finish there. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. So I think the key things there are to illustrate some of the things that would need to be done, echoing the principles enshrined in the original New Deal, the Roosevelt New Deal, which were greater government activism, government direction and control of investments in infrastructure and regulation of key areas of the market. And what Mark has done there is ably illustrate for us a large number of different areas where those principles can be followed beneficially for humankind, beneficially for the planet and for other species. Okay, so as you will perhaps observe, Jay is still not with us, and so that being the case, what I'm going to do is reiterate that I'll ask everyone to save their questions for the end, and then we can invite all speakers to address the questions one after the other, rather than have questions speaker by speaker. And so, in the absence of Jay, what I'd like to do now is move to Tahir, and then we'll have Jay, with luck, fingers crossed, if she arrived after Tahir. So, as I said earlier, Tahir, Secretary of the Greener Jobs Alliance, thank you very much indeed for coming along to speak to us this evening, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Danny, and thank you, and thanks to Peter as well for inviting me. I'm very happy to come and say a few words. I don't want to obviously go over the content of the Socialist Green New Deal, as Mark's done that very ably, obviously. But I do want to say, make some tangential remarks that I hope are useful and kind of feed into that debate. Firstly, it's really good, as you said, there are so many Green New Deals out there. It's really good to see one that is labelled as a Socialist Green New Deal, because I think what that does is make explicit what is implicit in the term Green New Deal anyway. And maybe not all the authors of the Green New Deals that are out there would like to acknowledge that, but I think it's inescapable that if you do a Green New Deal properly, then you are going down that path, and you have to acknowledge that, and for good reason. So just I wrote some notes essentially based on the some points in Pete's email, so forgive me if it might seem a little bit random. Firstly, the idea that there are many Green New Deals out there, why add another one? Well, firstly, I think it's incredibly welcome. I think you know, we the more voices we can add to the clamour to move in that direction, the better. I think also, you know, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? If you're looking at practical steps forward, if you took all the Green New Deals that have been written in the UK by various parties and overlaid them on each other, you're going to get that centre of the Venn diagram, which is that centre of the Venn diagram bit where we need to. So sorry.
I'm terribly sorry. Pete, could you possibly mute Anne's account, I think, because we're getting some stray noise from that. Sorry about that, Anne. Thank you very much. Sorry, Tahir, please continue.
No, that's okay. That's okay. So I think, you know, the urgent need is really for all these groups to kind of cohere around a common agenda and actually start taking these issues forward. The other dimension that really strikes me and struck me when I was reading the document is that you know, there are steps on a pathway towards doing something, and the Socialist Green New Deal as a document, it's a kind of vision of the future and where we need to be, and it's a very good one. I don't disagree with anything that's in the contents, I have to say. There are other bits that we need to kind of turn our attention to as well. In the Greener Jobs Alliance, for example, our work is very, very low level and grassroots. It's about building up from the bottom up, developing courses and training and rolling those out, working in conjunction with individual union branches, with regions, with local councils in some areas where they're sympathetic, and really building something at that level. So that's the exact opposite extreme, really. I was also one of the co-authors of the booklet Climate Jobs, produced by the Campaign Against Climate Change. You might, yeah, that one there, thank you. Which is probably closer to, in terms of its perspective, is probably closer to your own document, in the sense that it's a kind of vision of where we need to get to, but it does quite a detailed assessment of different sectors of the economy. And I completely echo Mark's words that it's not just. In fact, that book used to be called 1 Million Climate Jobs, but we quickly realised that there's actually millions of climate jobs. And in fact, some of your numbers I thought were underplayed, Mark, because, you know, in terms of retrofit, I think we're looking at 1 million plus to do a proper comprehensive programme, hundreds of thousands in the transport sector to do exactly the kind of transformations that you described. So I think that's really my thing about the document, is that it's a great setting out of a vision of the future, and while there's work going on at the moment at the grassroots level, we kind of need those extra steps as well to get us from here to there, and is what I think about that. what I really like in the document, I do want to dwell on a couple of points about it without hopefully reiterating what you said, Mark, is firstly, it's thinking things through. It's not just saying, well, and you'll come across this in the media a lot, well, we need to substitute one thing with something else that's kind of carbon free. You know, you have a car and now you want an electric car, and it's just a simple substitution. Actually, once you start down that road of transforming how you produce things, what you produce, and where you produce it, you know, the implications are much more far-reaching than that for how we organise and live. I myself used to work in the aviation sector. It's very very difficult to be a trade unionist and a kind of climate activist in that area. But the whole thing about transport is that if you make the transformations you need in transport, it's not just about substituting, it's also about thinking about what you're going to put where do you grow things, where do you build things, what kind of transport do you need in order to accommodate that changed, that transformed society, really. And that vision of what society will look like also bounces back to what your transport system will look like. So there's a kind of reciprocal relationship there. And that also, the same thing goes for geography and what you actually do with the land. I mean, I liked that point about breaking down the urban and the rural, because you do need to think about land use and freeing up the land, and using technology as well to enable you to free up the land. I think the use of modern technology and restoring nature are symbiotically linked, in effect. And you know, it's not a case of the common criticism that, oh, you want to go back to the Middle Ages, don't you? Those two things are linked. In terms of jobs, yes, there are millions, but we can also utilise technology. And I noticed that the document also mentions universal basic income as well, in terms of helping to erase poverty. And I think that there are three things there that we need to kind of balance and work out. What work is it we need to do? What work do we actually need to do? Because we know there are millions of jobs. Can we use technology to do some of the more boring and routine and kind of soul destroying, if you like, work? And what does that mean for our working lives? And therefore, you know, where does the role of UBI come in? So there's a kind of balancing act to be thought through there. And finally, the other thing, I can't remember if the document actually mentions about public ownership, but as soon as you get over as soon as you start making the links between different sectors and how they need to be coordinated and organised, you're immediately outside of the capitalist box, aren't you? Because the segmentation and silo mentality of how things are organised in the market system can't cope with that kind of level of coordination that you actually need. Again, for me, working in aviation, you know, all those airlines are in competition with each other for the same routes, let alone the competition with trains and with cars in certain circumstances. Just seems ridiculous. You need a transport system that's coordinated, integrated, and works to get you from A to B, not for all these different modes to be in competition with one another. It seems completely against what transport is actually about. But the other thing I did want to talk about, and I don't want to go on too long, Danny, so do feel free to interject if I do, but I did just, of course, want to talk about the role of workers in bringing about change, because I was a trade union representative, and this is close to my heart, and it's also key to making the kind of transformations we need. I think it's, you know, it's all very well us going out with our placards and demonstrating, and I'm certainly not underplaying that. We do need to do it. We need to show our strength and everything. But what the RMT have shown us this summer with the rail strikes is that the effectiveness of withholding your labour can't be understated. You know, just how important that is to actually making that change. It's an essential component of it if we're to actually go forward. Is to bring workers with us, essentially. I mean, the Greener Jobs Alliance is about doing exactly that. But I have to say, at the moment, we're in a kind of situation of polarisation amongst the trade union movement. You may or may not know about the kind of motions that have been passed at the TUC the last couple of years, which seem to take us backwards in terms of where we are in the name of job protection. And those same quarters also, I mean, I've heard this just the other day, repeated again, it's like a party line, that green issues are kind of middle class, and actually our working class members don't want to know about that because they've got their jobs and we have to protect their jobs. I think, well, you know, is that really true? I mean, that's kind of a discredit, isn't it, to workers who are very conscious about the need for change and are very aware that their jobs will change at some point, and would actually like that to be done in a planned way and in a way that actually involves them as workers. I also think it will probably come as news to those who are at the sharp end of climate change, and because we know it's the most vulnerable communities that feel the worst effects in terms of floods and fires and so on. For me personally, I mean, I think it's the biggest obstacle for us in taking things forward from theory into practice is to get those workers on side. So how do we do that? I mean, if you take aviation as an example, this applies to all other high carbon sectors as well, but it's the one I know about. I don't blame workers for being worried about losing their jobs. If they work in aviation, if they work in oil and gas, I understand they're worried about losing their jobs because, let's face it, you know, this government over the last 10, 12 years, the austerity economy, the gig economy, 0 hours contracts, all these things, there's a fear of losing one's job that is probably greater than it has been at any time that I can ever remember. So I do understand that. Unions defending those members against the attacks of their employers, of course they have to. That's what unions are about. I mean, and they have to continue to do that. Where I get a little bit kind of antsy about it is when they say, well, we need to carry on doing the things we're doing, for example, in fossil fuels or in aviation, or even expand those industries. Then I think I understand why you're saying that, but you're not really paying attention to what's going on in reality. And especially when they kind of align with the very same employers who are also attacking their terms and conditions. I mean, for me, this is a feat of mental gymnastics that you can hold in your head to thoughts like, on the one hand, industrial action amongst your members against an employer who's attacking your terms and conditions, your pay, your jobs, yet at the same time sitting at a table with them and saying, we need to do more of this stuff because that's the only way of protecting our job numbers. We have to show that there's an alternative, and that alternative actually has greater numbers in it in terms of job, and it's the real source of long-term job security. For me, the two ideas that you can hold on to that are consistent, that you fight for your members' jobs in whatever industry it is today, but you also demand to be involved in talks about what that workforce will look like tomorrow. Protect your job members now and tomorrow. I'll kind of wind up there because there was other stuff, but I'm happy to take it in terms of questions. What I'd say is what Green New Deals do, and this document is exemplary in doing this, is pushing us towards a point where we can recognise what our vision of the future looks like. And I think as we progress, we'll if we get people on board, we'll gradually reach a tipping point where that support will accumulate. And actually, once I like the fact, for example, Mark, that it says in there that it's a medium-term vision, because I think if you get to that medium term, you'll have shown enough benefits of a Green New Deal or a Socialist Green New Deal that people will actually demand us to go beyond the medium term towards those long-term aims as well, because it will just show a vision of a better society. I'll leave it for there now, Danny, and thanks very much again for the invitation.
Thank you, Tahir, very much appreciated, and your observations there about trade unions. I know certainly that Roy, who's with us, and Becky, who's with us this evening, like myself, are members of Unite, and I think sometimes we despair at the intersectional fighting that goes in just within Unite about this question. Unite, as you're probably aware, is organised into what are effectively parallel vertical silos. And some of those silos seem to be firmly wedded to the retention indefinitely of fossil fuel industries and armaments manufacture. And there are other silos that are able to think in a less blinkered way about the future of humankind. And sometimes it can feel a little bit as if you're banging your head against a brick wall in contexts like that. So we are now at 6:40. It looks as if Jay will join us perhaps in 10 minutes or so. So we have 10 minutes until our third and final contribution. So what I'm proposing to do in the intervening 10 minutes is to take points and questions. I may ask Pete to take over the chair just for 2 minutes because there's someone at my door. But what I'm going to do is sort of recognise Alan, who has his hand up. Let Alan make his contribution, and then Pete, are you okay just to take the chair just for 2 minutes? 2 minutes, okay. Alan, please.
Yeah, sorry I had to miss the first part of this chat because the phone went. I had to take it, and it was somebody from XR North Lakes telling me that the government has approved the new coal mine in Cumbria. So it's just to give a heads up to everybody here, but also in particular to Pete, to say I will be sending him very shortly some main points that we're asking people immediately, wherever they are, especially if they're on Twitter, to do some tweeting, to have a kind of a Twitter storm to say how much they oppose it. I'll send the information to Pete and he can pass it on to people. There will obviously be local, there's a protest in Penrith going to take place this Friday lunchtime. There's going to be a protest outside the site for the new mine on Saturday. And we'll be obviously thinking about what we do as the weeks and months move on and so on. But we really would like people, if they're on Twitter, to use Twitter today if possible, and if not, certainly tomorrow. And if you're not on Twitter but you're on other social media, if you can do the same, emails, letters to friends, family, councillors, MPs, local papers, all that kind of stuff, to make as much fuss right from the beginning as possible, please. That's me done. Thank you.
Thanks. Does anybody else want to chip in at this point, either on the news that Alan has just given us or on the broader discussion we've been having? Tarsam, I see you're indicating. Would you like to speak?
Yes, please. Yes, some great talks. I just want to follow up on what they were saying, and especially about the role of like trade unions. But basically, I think where I coming from is like eco-capitalism is an oxymoron, really. When we're talking about the environment, I mean, it's capitalism that's brought us where we are through its exploitation, its imperial extraction, environmental degradation. So for solutions, we've got to look obviously towards eco-socialism, and the trade unions really have got to be at the head of that, because I think this system of 300 years, one of the tragedies of it, it's alienated us from nature, and it's alienated the worker from nature. I mean, I'm not read up on Marx, but I know that Marx talks about alienation and stuff like this. And so what we've got to do, I think, we're part of the Green New Deal. It's a very profound project, I think, you know, because it's basically about human survival. But it's also about reconnecting us back with nature, back in harmony with nature and not against nature. And I think this is part of the thing. And then it puts the worker no longer kind of battling against nature, but actually and passive in the capitalist system, but as an agent of change, because what they're doing is they're sort of preserving the planet, really, doing the most important thing, taking responsibility for each other, which is one of the core, but you know, sort of tenets of trade unionism. And it gives people control back over their power. There's a lovely slogan, I can't remember where it's from, you know, sun, wind and tidal power, led by workers' power. And I think this is like what we got to look at. So workers are no longer cogs in the capitalist machine, but agents of social change, safeguarding the planet. And I think this is like what we're looking at now. There's so much like, you know, with the cost of living crisis, it's all connected basically. You know, the cost of living crisis, the economic inequality, the environment. So, you know, we've got global warming, but people are worried about their heating bills. You know, we've got glaciers melting and society fragmenting. And we've got to sort of start reintegrating this so that politics is no longer divorced from morality and economics no longer divorced from compassion, and that the human being is integrated with nature again. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tarsam. Yes, and that reminded me of a remark that someone made at a recent joint meeting that involved the Eco-Socialist Alliance. Someone observed that environmentalism without socialism is basically just gardening, and I thought that was very telling. So we have a hand from Dave King. Dave, please.
Yeah, hi, and just to mention that I'm part of the new Lucas Plan group, and I mean, well, I'll come to that in a minute. First of all, the question I had for Mark and the people who put together that document is how much you thought about, you know, what does seem to be pretty well firmly you know, established and accepted now, which is that, you know, most of the, you know, renewable forms of energy are in fact, you know, highly carbon intensive in terms of their production, and also, you know, involve a great deal of mineral extraction, which, as I'm sure we all know, is generally environmentally devastating. So I wonder, you know, actually how much of the solution to our problems, you know, actually, particularly, you know, solar and wind power really are. So that's the question. The comment is in relation, you know, in relation to the Lucas Plan, which I'm sure I don't need to tell you all about. But, you know, their slogan was socially useful production. And obviously, so, you know, ideas for a Green New Deal, you know, are consistent with that and capture that to some extent. But I think, I mean, I think that, you know, we need to go a great deal further down that line, and that is actually the key to, you know, longer term survivability, both for humans and nature, is looking, you know, looking seriously at what human beings really need actually to survive and flourish, and to draw a line between those things and things which, you know, may be nice to have and maybe, you know, on some level increase the enjoyment of some people's lives, but you know, are often, you know, highly damaging, including you know, transportation, actually, including so much you know, tourism, for example. So yeah, I guess I'd suggest that is quite a critical aspect of what any real you know, eco-socialist future would look like, and I'd be interested to hear you know, what people think about actually how far we can really take that. Okay.
Thank you, Dave. So I think, well, perhaps we'll have one more contribution from Les, and then we shall come back to our two speakers to address those points and questions. Les, I think you might want to adjust your camera angle slightly so that we can see you slightly better, but otherwise I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I want to go back to the point raised by Tahir that some trade union leaders, I mean, especially in the carbon intensive industries, dismiss anything green as middle class and claim to speak for their members when they do so. That's the crucial point. And I think that the problem, that although that may be true, the problem is a little more subtle than that. because those trade union leaderships are fervent believers in low carbon green technologies, such as carbon capture and storage. And in this respect, they are politically aligned with the leadership of those industries in basically using carbon capture and storage and any other decarbonization technologies as an excuse to continue indefinitely those high carbon industries, you know, and until the technologies somehow magically materialize as feasible. So I think we need a way to counter that version of a green future, supposedly green future, which is a little more subtle than simply dismissing anything green as middle class. I mean, they're actually in a cross-class alliance with the exploiter class, and the class that's exploiting their members. Why that has happened, I mean, it didn't have to be that way. We need some analysis, and likewise any dissent within such unions, you know, such as the GMB, Unite, and so on. So, I mean, I published an article about this on the Greener Jobs Alliance blog, which was edited partly by Tahir. So here's an opportunity, perhaps, for him to give his thoughts on that question.
Okay, thank you, Les. Perhaps it's worth cautioning at this point against making statements that purport to sound as if we distrust trade union leaders on the grounds that they don't represent fairly or don't represent the interests of workers, because that's also an argument that's often made by Conservative ministers who wish to claim that railway workers or nurses or others would really rather carry on working and are being forced to vote for strike action and go out and strike in a way that does not serve their interests. So I think we just have to be mindful about how we position that issue when we talk about it. However, it's not for me to say, because we're going to solicit the views of our speakers on those two sets of questions. So Dave was interested in renewables. Renewables are carbon intensive. They consume large volumes of rare earth minerals. Can they truly be the solution? And you know, ultimately, do we need to think about limits on consumption by way of extension to the Lucas Plan concept of socially useful production? So that was one cluster of issues, if you like, and then Les's question about the odd position of trade union leaders who find themselves potentially in an unholy alliance with the captains of capitalism in seeking to defend continued reliance on fossil fuels. So let's go to Mark first, and then we'll come to Tahir. So Mark, initial thoughts on those contributions? Where is Mark? Have you lost Mark?
No, he's still here.
I dropped out. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. So did you catch the questions, Mark?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Over to you.
Yes. Thanks, Tahir and the other speakers for their points. I think one of the major areas that's weak in our document, in the Green Socialist New Deal, is the whole area of energy. We need to do a lot more research on the whole sector of power generation and the transition.
We appear to be having difficulty with Mark's internet connection. So I wonder if, Tahir, we could pick up with you, and perhaps Mark will come back to us in a moment.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Yeah, thank you for those questions. Really good points made, actually. Dave, in terms of, I think Mark was going to answer about the carbon intensive nature of energy production, but the bit that of Dave's contribution that I was really thinking of was about reducing consumption, which of course, yeah, absolutely, there is something in that which needs to be got to, and this is where I think Mark's or where the document's status as a kind of medium-term plan is kind of important, because it's a kind of marker on the way to further developments. I mean, for me, I think that, for example, transport, that when we talk about an integrated and decarbonised transport system, and we talk about it being free and cheap, or either being free or cheap at least, the idea is to broaden it out so that it's more accessible, but at the same time to squash it down so that we're not doing as much travelling. We should be able to organise our society so that there's not the need for some of the journeys that are taking place at the moment, for example, movement of goods and freights and stuff like that. And yet at the same time, we also want to democratise it by enabling people who have no access to being able to get from A to B to be able to do so. And I think probably the same thing with similar principle with housing is that we're not saying, right, we need to knock down all the existing houses and build much more decarbonised housing. You do have to not waste stuff and make use of what it is that we've got. That's probably a little bit tangential to Dave's point, I realise, but the thing that always strikes me about I mean, it was the Lucas plan, it was so good, but in talking about socially useful production, and what they did was they wrote a list of things that they could do. Of course, we're in a position where we have an advantage that we probably don't need a list, because we all know the stuff that needs to be done. And if we could agree that we could do it in that particular way, then we could actually get on with it. In terms of Leslie's points, yeah, I mean, it's complicated, isn't it? The way that these alignments actually pan out. I mean, the fact is that GMB does actually try and portray those who are advancing green issues as middle class. It's a little bit disingenuous. That's kind of a facade that they put up, I think, for their members, but to try and push that line. But he's absolutely right that they're peddling essentially the same greenwash solutions, carbon capture and storage and so on, that their employers are, and they are aligned on that, which is what I said, is that they sit at the table even with the same people who are attacking their jobs and terms and conditions. The other thing I'd say is quickly in response to Tarsam, because I noticed Jay has also appeared. In Tarsam's point, excellent. Just think about it. How much better would people feel doing jobs that were actually restoring the world rather than destroying it? I just think that there's a positive vibe to come out of that can't be understated, really. I'll leave it at that for the moment, Danny. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think Tarsam's point is extremely valuable. I was just briefly outlining to some people before the meeting started some work that I had come across recently, where someone has modelled what it's like if you were to run down all fossil fuels, let's say over 10 or 15 years, and you were to eliminate nuclear, and you were to make heroic assumptions about how much renewable capacity you could build in the intervening time. If then you were to say, well, actually, we can't just build as much renewable as we would like, but we need to be constrained by recognising that we are 1% in the UK. We are approximately 1% of the world's population. So if we consumed 1% of the rare earth metals that would be required to build solar panels and wind turbines and all the rest of it, we would go from a position where currently in the UK we consume approximately 2,000 terawatts of energy per annum to a situation where in 10 or 15 years we might be able to generate 300 terawatts. And if you were to extrapolate across consumption generally, you would find that the adjustment required would be to take everyone in terms of income and well-being to where a person on the 20th decile currently of an income distribution of the UK would be. Now what that highlights is that without some other really compelling narrative, that would be politically unacceptable. And those narratives, I think, have to be about fairness, about equality, and about nature and about an enhanced quality of life. So these the more we think about the next iteration of this green socialist New Deal, the more we have to grapple with these questions, because they're big, important, they're almost seemingly intractable. And Tarsum and Dave and Les, in their questions and observations, remind us of those facts and point us in some of the directions that our thinking needs to develop as we move forward. So, as Tahir has noted, Jay is with us. Jay is currently in possession of some material that has been supplied by the Women's Budget Group. Jay, I had mentioned earlier that you were going to take us through this material that has been supplied by the Women's Budget Group with the theme of a feminist Green New Deal towards a green and caring economy. And I think, as we go through this talk, Pete is going to share his screen, and Jay will highlight some items from the material supplied by the Women's Budget Group. So, Jay, if you're about ready now, I can hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And first of all, I'm sorry that my diary said 7 o'clock, not 6 o'clock. But anyway, I'm sure I've missed a great deal of useful material. The reason I'm speaking is because we originally booked Sarah Rice of the Women's Budget Group to come and talk to us, but she had to withdraw and they couldn't find anybody else who wasn't too busy. So I most reluctantly said I would do my best to fill in for what Sarah would have said. And the Women's Budget Group has sent me material, Sarah's speech that she gave somewhere else, and also the slides that Peter is showing now on the screen. And I will try not to repeat what I think you will have been saying already, and to introduce some new material. So, first of all, if we could change to the next slide. This is about the fact that women and girls are differentially affected by climate change, and governments rarely consider that. It's true in the UK, it's also true abroad, where women are often the ones who suffer most when there's climate change of a flood or a drought. The men can escape to somewhere else, but the women have to look after the children and try and keep them alive. And it's much more difficult for them to deal with the situation. And women's voice has been underrepresented in climate discussion and really ought to be considered. I think it brings in some new and hopeful ideas about what to do. I think we can go to the next slide. I should perhaps say at first that the Women's Budget Group, working with the Women's Environmental Network, is fully committed to socialist type change. They recognise the damage that is done by the profit motive being dominant in governments of whatever kind, whether they're Tory, Labour or Liberal. And what they're saying is that profit should not be prioritised over the well-being of us human beings and also the well-being of the rest of the planet. So if we could move on to slide 3, the next slide, please. So what they suggest is reorienting the economy in terms of changing the priorities, the aims, that is to make sure people are well off and have all they need, changing ownership models to public ownership or co-ops or small enterprises, local mixed farming, that sort of thing. also changing monetary policy, and yes, supporting a global, green and a caring economy. I've got another few more slides which expand on this, but I think you will have heard most of it already. Can we move, Peter, to the next slide? So perhaps you've covered a lot of this, so I'll just leave you to read those arguments there. I think we'll all agree with that. I think they're all in what Mark has said already, and possibly Tahir as well. And the next slide, please. The Women's Budget Group is not only concerned about women. It's important to emphasise that we're also very interested in ethnic minorities and the working class people who are usually in rented accommodation and often don't own a car but suffer the effects. So we want to move towards active travel and reduce aviation demand, which is mainly from rich people, and we're interested in the majority, not just the rich, obviously. So next slide, please. Important, we think, to prioritise the, sorry, I'm just turning pages. Prioritising work that is socially valuable. And that, of course, relates to our aim of the transition, just transition, from the kind of work which is unhelpful, harmful, like weapons, like massive steel works for more ships and more global trade, more transport, more roads, more infrastructure that doesn't really help most people. Do we need new airports, for example? We want to rebalance the economy away from this energy intensive and carbon intensive work towards social infrastructure, with all sectors desegregated and equal access to opportunities, decent pay, etc., and a shorter working week. This is very important to women who, as we know, bear the brunt of caring work, and we need it redistributed between men and women. Many men would like to have a caring job and do their fair share, but it needs to go further. So next slide, please. How we shop also is important. We need to make sure that consumption is not just for the rich, biased towards wants more than needs. It's important everyone has access to what they need, and also that what goods are available are durable, designed for reuse and repair. And reducing consumption means reducing parts of manufacturing retail and improving the remainder in consultation with unions, and protecting the environment and workers across the supply chain. So the last in this section is what we have and how we eat, and that clearly affects our health if we have a good plant-based diet, but also the environment by getting rid of the industrialized farming, which is cruel to animals and not much good for people either, and which involves a lot of fossil fuels in fertilizer, with runoff into our rivers and seas, and with other environmental damage. seeing food as a right, not just a commodity for profit, but something that people need for their well-being and health. Communal dining projects is another idea that affects how we eat. It's great fun to eat with lots of other people. We can all keep warm together, and there are communal projects already springing up. Agroecological farming and well-paid desegregated jobs. And the next slide, please. Now, this is one that is absolutely key to what the Women's Budget Group is trying to say, that we need to recognise care as a crucial key to social well-being, and having social care works being treated as quality, high status, high trained jobs, which are well paid and which allow enough time for carers to stay with their clients, not having to rush after 15 minutes to somewhere else and be late and have to pay for their own petrol. These, at the moment, are terribly badly paid jobs with terrible conditions and privatised as well. So we need to invest in a universal quality social care service on a par with the health service. Another one that's obviously very important to women is free universal childcare, from the end of parental leave to include care that women need in future. This will enable women to go to jobs that they can really concentrate on if they want to, and to build into good careers and not constantly struggling to juggle expensive privatised childcare with their own jobs that they would like to do properly. We must disentangle care for profit and give decent pay and conditions for the care workforce, and also have a gender balance. Children need men as well as women looking after them. They need to see that men and women can do both kinds of jobs, the traditional feminine jobs and the traditional masculine jobs, and that they can do, when they grow up, any kind of job that they're interested in without gender segregation. And of course, decent care and paying conditions. Now I've got some extra data to add in on this issue, because I've found out elsewhere from the Women's Budget Group that investing 2% of GDP in the care sector would create 1.4 million jobs. That's 2.7 times as many jobs as equivalent investment would be in construction. And it's 6.3 times as many jobs for women and 1.1% times for men. Secondly, free universal childcare, which I've mentioned, for all 3.1 million children who need it, would cost 1.8 to 2.7% of GDP, depending on childcare wages, and it would create 1.4 to 1.5 million full-time equivalent jobs. So there's a lot of options for creating extra jobs in the transition from a profit-based, material-based to a care-based economy. Also, revaluing care and the public sector, including lifelong learning, recognising the importance of key workers to us all, requires higher wages, better training and working conditions, and more job security in all those public sector occupations. And that would mainly benefit women currently in precarious, low-paid jobs. I've got a lot of statistics on that, but I think probably you've had enough of statistics for one day. And the reference for that is Women's Budget Group, 2020. It's called What Would a Feminist Green New Deal Look Like? And it's a draft of it's a briefing from the Women's Budget Group and Women's Environmental Network Group in May the 20th, 2020. That's where I got it from. So can we go to the final slide, Peter, please?
Okay.
And the reason I want to talk about something different, I don't think you've covered how we would pay for all this transition. And it is a relevant question. And if we don't address it, we won't be taken seriously. So I'm going to read out now what Sarah Rice has written in her talk. She talks about the great increase of employment in the NHS and in the social care, and these being labour-intensive sectors because care tasks are rooted in human relations. They're low carbon and they are low resource intensive, and the average job in health and care produces 26 times less greenhouse gas than a manufacturing job and 200 times less than agricultural jobs currently do. Sorry, I was going to go on to tax. The question that often follows is, how would we pay for this? The answer is through a combination of progressive taxation and borrowing. On the tax element, we need to revise the tax system to make it fairer, taxing wealth properly, for instance, taxing profits and especially excessive profits, as we're witnessing in the energy production sector. It's also about removing the subsidies and the tax relief that oil and gas companies are benefiting from right away. And it's about taxing the forms of income like capital gains, dividends and other wealth sources at least the same rate as income from labour. So taxing wealth as much as wages are taxed. Also about reviewing how we tax land, considering a land value tax, taxing property, taxing inheritance. A big part in this investment would also have to come from borrowing, at least initially, to make the necessary transition to greener and more sustainable energy, manufacturing and expansion of social infrastructure. One reason for this is it's irresponsible not to. We urgently need greener economies to leave a livable planet to our children. We need huge investment in onshore wind and other renewables, the development of tidal and wave energy, for example. At the moment, the number of people economically inactive due to ill health because of long waiting lists, that they can't get the treatment. This leads to people being more ill and having a worse quality of life, more women in particular leaving the workforce to care for the sick relatives. That all means less tax revenue and more spending on benefits. So borrowing to invest in the foundation of the economy makes perfect economic sense, as well as being the right thing to do morally. We've also shown at the Women's Budget Group how this investment in care, investment in social infrastructure, largely pays for itself because of the number of jobs it creates in these sectors and across the economy through the multiplier effect. Therefore, the extra tax revenues that flow into public coffers and the reduction in social security spending on more people in good jobs that are well paid and which pay national insurance, of course, and taxation. So the means are there to achieve a green and caring economy. that I think we would all want. It benefits the majority, not the rich. We had a massive change straight after World War II in free-for-all healthcare and education, and a great deal of building social housing affordable for everybody. We can do something like that again. It's perfectly feasible, and I thought it was important to read out the section on tax. I'm not an economist, so I can't make it up myself, but I hope that's been a helpful and constructive contribution from the Women's Budget Group. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Much appreciated. And I realise that talking to someone else's slides, someone else's material, is an extra hard task, and you did it very well, and we're greatly appreciative of that. Thank you. It's interesting, Jay, just earlier, Tahir was saying if you took all of the Green New Deals that there are around the place and laid them one on top of the other, there would be variations around the edges, but the core of them, to a very large extent, would be similar. And I think a lot of what you presented from the Women's Budget Group tended to confirm that view, that there's a great deal of commonality here. I think all people of a progressive turn of mind are recognising what the problems are and what the solutions are, and certainly the emphasis there on the caring economy is something that we would all share. And indeed, just before he left, I think Gordon Peters in the chat also echoed that. So I reckon if we can go for about another 5 minutes, and then we have to wind up. So I'm going to open it up for further questions or contributions. I've got a hand from Alan, so let's go to Alan first.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting session, and I'm sorry I had to miss the first part of it with the phone call about the coal mine. There's just one point I think I'd like to make, and I know Alan Thornett was hoping to be able to come to this and he couldn't. And that there are issues around Starmer's latest kind of green manifesto stuff that he's been talking about, and I don't know what people's views are about it. That there seem to be two camps. There are those that say, well, that's Starmer, you can't trust Starmer, he broke all his 10 promises when he stood for the leadership election and so on. And then there is the view, which I have to say I go with, whether you can trust him or not. The important thing is he's actually put down on paper a whole load of policy aims which are good in themselves. And especially now with the announcement of a new coal mine, it gives us something to campaign for, because a lot of people, when I get, when I've been involved in like XR protests, they say, oh yeah, well, that's what you say, but there isn't a sensible politician that's calling for the kind of things that you're calling for. Well, whether you call Starmer sensible or not, he is mainstream, and he is actually arguing or claiming he's going to do stuff, an awful lot of money into a renewable energy company, going to decarbonize the national grid, etc. And I would have thought that gives us something to run with, whether or not we can actually trust him to keep it. So I just kind of think we need to be a bit more positive about what he's saying and use it as a gift to push the agenda for Green New Deals. That's all.
Thank you for that, Alan. And I'm reluctant to start a whole debate about that at this point, because we're approaching the end of this meeting, and I think potentially that's something that we could have another meeting on, and it would need a meeting in its own right. I think because there's an awful lot to that. The naysayers would say, well, actually what he's proposing is to create one small competitor in a very crowded field with lots of startups, only really dealing with one part of the problem. That's at the opposite end of the spectrum. I think we'd all agree that it's useful that we could see it as a wedge issue that starts to drive the issue into public awareness, public consciousness more widely, and we ought not to undervalue the opportunity that it creates there. But to what extent we would find that it is aligned with our own policy objectives, to what extent it promises to do enough That's where the real debate is, but perhaps that's for another day. We do have a hand from Anne Gray. Anne, please.
Thank you, Jay, for a wonderful presentation of a wonderful report. I just want to make some comments about the feasibility of having huge public investment in some of these sectors. I mean, yes, it needs to be huge, but the question which is always asked in the tax policy group of the Green Party is how can we afford all of these things at once within a reasonable period? And I think, you know, what also needs to be borne in mind is that there is a capacity for unpaid work amongst the population if, and this is a very big if, we had a shorter working week. And, you know, I think there's a big question socially as well as to how much we want to see things commodified, which is not the same as turned into for-profit services, but which is saying, you know, something is commodified when it's made the subject of a wage work relation. And maybe we need to think of how to give people time and also land to be caring for each other more without the intervention of any kind of state service, and to be producing their own food without commercial farming. I mean, Cuba had an absolutely wonderful example of this in what they did after the Soviet Union collapsed, and they couldn't sell sugar to the Soviet Union and get lots of foreign exchange anymore. So I think, you know, we do need to look at access to land and access to time as very important components of a caring economy. Thank you.
Thank you, and yes, those are interesting points and novel, because I've been dealing with some people from the Tax and Fiscal Policy Working Group insofar as they overlap with the Green Party Economic Policy Working Group, and we too have been grappling with some of those questions about the extent of public investment that will be required to accomplish the transition, and how do you generate enough to support it. You know, at one end of the spectrum, potentially we've got this capacity to look at land and time. At the other end, arguably, you've got a move towards a more centrally directed planned economy where decisions about how a community allocates resources between tomorrow's productive capacity, which is investment, and today's consumption, are left not to the market, but there's a greater degree of social intervention, be it through cooperatives, or be it through local authorities, or be it through state bodies, national state bodies. There's a whole spectrum of different possibilities in between those two extremes. But I think you raised some very interesting and telling points there. Yes, I see Jenny in the chat is also saying, as has Martin, as has Jay, that there has been some confusion clearly about the start time for this evening's meeting. So we are in fact now approaching the end rather than the end of the first half hour. And I think probably we don't have time for any more questions or points. I would just offer Tahir and Mark and Jay the opportunity for 30 seconds worth of closing remarks if they wish to take advantage of it. And let's go through in the original order. So Mark, are you back with us yet?
I am.
Yeah, yes you are.
Story about me being cut off for 10 minutes by my wonky internet here. Sorry about that. I was just about to conclude a discussion about the energy policy and decentralising renewable energy to community level, democratically run by workers and communities, I believe could be a solution, and at least a carbon neutral one. It's centralised energy that's high carbon intensive, but decentralised energy, I believe, is less carbon dependent. I mean, actually, you know, windmills, for instance, could come back literally made of wood, and I think they could still function in a new economy. That's my view. So I think we need to do a bit more research on the energy field. And I'm sorry I failed to mention anything about land and agriculture and food in my introduction, but that's an important, very big important section of the New Deal. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Tahir, your closing 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it would take more than that, but I think just very quickly, on public investment, I mean, I'm no expert, but I would question, you know, and I'd love to know what the answers are to, you know, how much we spend on things like subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, or indemnifying employers to protect them against strikes while they're trying to break strikes, and you know, overpaying for private contracts, which are, you know, overseen by your rich. I'd love to know how much of that adds up to, actually.
Yeah.
In terms of Starmer, I just say very quickly that it's good point, Alan, to say, you know, that it looks good on paper, you know, that I think the juries would be out, you know, until we actually see it happen, about what it would actually, how it actually pan out. But nevertheless, if you offered me him tomorrow in place of the shower that we have in at the moment, I'd take that, because then we can generate the pressure to do more, exactly as you say. Finally, just a quick point on Jay's contribution. There's a little bullet point in there about aviation, frequent flyer and all that sort of thing. I thought, oh, that I agree with that, but you know what? It's much more complicated than that. What does that tell you? It tells you that, as with the Lucas plan, using the skills and expertise of workers to solve the issues in each of the sectors is critical. It's not to exclude anyone else, because we've got a stake in it, but it does point to the massive contribution that workers in each sector can make, freed from the obligation of profit, to make some of our abstract plans into a concrete reality. Thanks very much again, and thanks, Danny.
Thanks for that, Tahir, and I don't think anyone here would disagree with that very important point you make towards the end there about the key role that workers have to have in not just executing but formulating the plans, the blueprint for all of this transition. Jay, please.
Thank you. I must apologise for getting the time wrong. Meetings usually start at 7, and I thought it was 7 that we were starting. I will have missed some very good talks, and I'm sorry about that. One point I'd like to make finally is thank you, Anne, for mentioning Cuba. I wanted to mention that because they have the highest literacy rate in almost all the world, the highest ratio of doctors to the population of almost anywhere in the world. And people are not starving. They are growing food in all sorts of places. They're not able to trade because very much at all, because of the embargo, but they are a very caring society. I've been there twice and I've seen it for myself. And the focus on the kind of jobs that we've been talking about for a green and caring economy are enormous in Cuba. That is what they do, and it is green. There are places in Cuba, they don't take down their forests. They let the wildlife live there. So they are green, environmental, and they've survived in spite of the big evil empire next door.
Thank you, Jay. Now, as we approach the close, Pete has a hand up. Pete.
I merely wanted to say that the recording of the meeting, I'll edit out some of the more boring stuff at the beginning, but not the main substance of the discussion will be recorded and circulated via Green Left social media. So for those who've missed parts of it, don't worry, you'll be able to see it.
Okay, so just to wind up, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, in particular to thank those who are not members of the Green Party or of Green Left for coming along, and of course our guest speaker Tahir for coming along to talk to us this evening from the Greener Jobs Alliance. But thank you to all, much appreciated. There will be some more talks and meetings in this series in the new year. Look out for them. We hope to see you there. And finally, once again, thank you very much indeed to everyone. Good night, and look after yourself. Good night. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Night.